be able to recognize that there are three kingdoms that have been described thus far: plants, animals, and fungi. And what separates them is their cell structure and nutritional source. Plants contain cellulose cell walls and are autotrophic photosynthesizers. Fungi have cell walls, but made of chitin, and they are saprotrophic. We will define this in a moment. Animals have no cell walls and are heterotrophic. Notice this cladogram, these branching points. There's a left versus right. This brings us to the concept of a dichotomous key. The term dichotomy means to divide into two parts. And so a dichotomous key is a series of choices that lead the user to the correct name of a given item, usually the species identification. What we're looking at here is a very simplified dichotomous key. Let's say I was an alien from outer space and I took Earth 101. And when I arrive on this planet and I come face to face with this organism, I can ask myself, plant or animal, and choose animal and the branch that takes me from animal to the next series of questions. Does it live underwater or on land? Well, because I'm on land and it's in a tree, I'm going to say on land. And that brings me to the next question: hair or feathers? And because it has feathers, I can make a distinction and come to the answer, it's a bird. Now, again, this is a very simplified dichotomous key, but you can see that there's always two options, and you pick the better option of the two. Now let's talk about fungi. We will begin with the anatomy. Know the terms mycelium and hyphae. Mycelium refers to the entire root component. It doesn't get called roots officially because roots only absorb water and minerals, but mycelium are able to absorb solid nutrients as well because they can excrete fluids, not just uptake them. Okay? So in the diagram here, we can see this entire branching green structure is the mycelium, and the hyphae is just one individual branch of that mycelium. Hyphae are then further described as either being septate or non-septate. Sometimes we see the word soanocytic. This refers to the compartmentalization within the hyphae. Soanocytic hyphae are completely hollow, and so organelles can move freely from cell to cell to cell as needed. The septate hyphae are partitioned, and so each individual cell is attached to its neighboring cell, but very few materials can move through them. In terms of which is better, evolutionary speaking, to each their own. They both have pros and cons, but this becomes one of those features that we can use to dichotomously identify a species. Not all fungi, but many exhibit a special type of growth known as dimorphism. Di meaning two, morph, forms. Dimorphic fungi have an advantage of being able to respond to their environment around them. When the environment is cool, say at 25 degrees Celsius or 70 degrees Fahrenheit, they can be elongated, long filamentous or mold-like structures, which allows them to reach out and explore the environment around them, looking for water or nutrients. But as things get hot, say 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, they will adjust their structures and separate out into single-celled components, like yeast. This allows them to decrease their water loss. And so these organisms, these special species that are dimorphic, have a better likelihood of surviving in an ever-changing environment. I mentioned that the nutritional acquisition of the eukaryotes differs. Fungi are saprotrophic. What this means is they are heterotrophs that eat something else, but they do the digestion outside their bodies. Fungi are able to excrete their digestive enzymes, their bile, out through their mycelium, and then in the soil, it will rapidly break down roadkill, debris, food, fertilizer, resources, and then the mycelium can drink in a liquid meal. Fungi are not the only organisms that do this. Earthworms can also do this. So there are a number of examples of saprotrophy. One thing I would like to point out is that Each organism has a few base requirements that are consistent for all life, like water, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. But in terms of other needs, there can be a range of requirements. What might be essential to one might be only a micronutrient to another. And so I want to introduce this concept of qualifiers. Qualifiers are terms that refer to how necessary is that item. An obligate qualifier describes something that's absolutely required. Without it, the organism would die. A facultative qualifier means meh, it's not needed, but it certainly is useful and would be appreciated if present. In this way, nutritional qualifiers are very similar to adjectives, where an adjective describes a noun, like that hair is silky, the qualifier describes a need. So looking in this panel here, we can see in panel A, we've got obligate aerobes. The fungi are only growing at the very top of this bacterial column where they've got exposure to air. We've got obligate anaerobes, only growing at the farthest, deepest part of this column where they've got the least amount of air present. And then we see our facultative aerobes or facultative anaerobes, in which case most of them are where there's air, but they're pretty much scattered all throughout because being facultative, it's not really a need. It's not necessary, but they'll utilize it. Another feature that we use to dichotomously divide fungi is their reproductive mechanism. Perfect fungi are those that can reproduce both sexually and asexually. Imperfect fungi are only capable of asexual reproduction. All fungi reproduce via spores, and these spores are capable of growing into their own organism, fully reconstituting the fungi. In terms of fungal structure, the prefix denotes different organizations of the reproductive body. A conidiospore is referring to spores that are not enclosed in a sac, and this is the diagram on the right that looks like a wheat stalk. The prefix sporangio refers to spores that are also themselves enclosed in a sac or an uber spore. The suffixes of fungal structures denote which aspect of the fungus are we looking at. So when we see spores with an S, we're referring to one of many, and therefore just an individual spore. If we see spore without the S as a singular version, we're referring to the large single reproductive structure. And when we refer to something as the for, or with the for suffix, we're referring to the stem or stalk that leads to the spore. So herein, we could see that A is a sporangiospores, B is the sporangiospore, and C is the sporangiophore, which is in contrast to D, the conidiospores, E, the conidiospore, and F, the conidiophore. Now let's take a look at the 5 distinct fungal groups. Tritiomycotas. These are an ancient lineage. They are the earliest fungi we have recorded. They exhibit sexual reproduction only through the key feature of zoospores. You may recall that these are flagellated spores, the precursors of sperm. Next up are the zygomycotas. Zygomycotas are perfect fungi. They can reproduce sexually and asexually. When they produce sexually, they use something known as a zygospore. When they reproduce asexually, they have a structure known as a sporangiospore. Their key feature is that they are very cold and heat tolerant, which leads us to their significance in terms of coinciding with humans in this life. The zygomycotas are those species of fungi that are responsible for food spoilage and food poisoning. The ascomycetes are another example of perfect fungi. When they reproduce sexually, they use ascus sacs. And when they reproduce asexually, their structure is known as a conidiospore. What makes them unique is that their overall shape exhibits a bowl or cup. The glomeromycotas are imperfect fungi, the only imperfect fungi. And what makes them unique is that they are able to form mycorrhizae. A mycorrhizae is a symbiotic relationship between a plant and a fungi. The plant, which is capable of photosynthesis, provides supplemental food stores to the fungus that burrows in and through its root structure, and the fungus helps increase water absorption for the plant. We can see in the diagram here, the thick brown is the root hair of the plant, and the small white or the small lollipop-looking structures out of that root hair, that's the fungus growing. This is a mutually beneficial relationship, so much so that more than 90% of plant species have this. It allows for plants to survive in less than ideal soil by increasing the water absorption by close to 1,000 times. The last group is the Basidiomycetes. This is our traditional mushroom. It is another perfect mushroom. And when it reproduces sexually, it's through a process known as karyogamy or through a structure known as the basidiocarp. It can reproduce asexually through a process known as fragmentation, in which case the mushroom is broken into smaller pieces, and those pieces reconstitute the original mushroom shape. Lastly, let's take a look at the role of mushrooms and fungi in general. First and foremost, they are decomposers. Interestingly enough, fungi are the only organism that can break down lignin from trees, which is a very tough substance. So without fungi, we would not be able to rot and decompose fallen trees. They also participate in a number of symbiotic relationships. We already mentioned mycorrhizae, but fungi also participate in the form of lichen. This is a fungus plus cyanobacteria partnership. Again, the fungus provides water, but also scaffolds around the cyanobacteria to provide them increased access to sunlight. So they're not shaded out by grass and debris nearby. The cyanobacteria, which are also photosynthetic organisms, are able to help provide food to the fungus. Not all fungi are good, though. There are pathogens too. When we describe something as a primary pathogen, this means that they are true pathogens capable of invading and growing in a healthy host. This is in contrast to an opportunistic pathogen, which is only able to take over when the host is otherwise compromised. Fungi cause damage to their host through the process of releasing toxins, which are essentially poisons secreted by a living cell. They can also replace tissue and essentially exhibit a cancerous-like growth.